All right, thank you everyone for joining us for the webinar today. I'm Mary Firestone from Mid-Atlantic Biosolids Association, and thank you to our panelists and moderator, Nick. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you, Mary. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Bonkoski, and I'm here to help moderate our first webinar of the year. Today, we're going to be focusing on biosolids and COP26, responding to climate change. So I'm on the board of directors at MABA and also on the programming committee. And today we're going to have 3 presentations for you. Each one's going to be approximately 25 minutes long, and then we're going to allow 5 minutes for questions afterwards. And then we're going to sum up everything and move on to the next one. So if you have questions after the presentation, we can get the presenters to answer your questions after today. So we're going to kick things off to keep things on track. So our first presenter is Mike Badzmierowski with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. So Mike is going to talk about soil sequestration of biosolids carbon and what we've learned so far. Quick background for Mike here. Mike's a soil health specialist for the Oregon Department of Agriculture. Prior to this, Mike was a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech. He received his PhD in 2019, where he focused on the use of biosolids as a soil amendment and how different biosolids processing methods may affect greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration potential. Mike's postdoctoral work is still in progress, and he's leading a team of reviewers and conducting the most comprehensive, transparent, and open access synthesis of soil carbon stock changes for land-applied biosolids. So welcome, Mike. Knock 'em dead.
Thank you, Nicholas. All right, so as long as everyone can see my presentation, I'm gonna get going. So I was kind of asked to talk about soil sequestration of biosolids and what we have learned. And what I first wanted to start off with everyone is kind of go over what soil organic matter and soil organic carbon theory is at the current standpoint, just so that we're all on kind of the same page. The first thing that we can first talk about really is that in the last 15 or so years, we've really had a dramatic shift in our understanding of soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. So soil organic carbon is really just a subset of soil organic matter. Carbon is not just sitting by itself. It is part of this matrix of different nutrients. And we estimate that for most soils, you might see the common figure of 58% carbon within the soil organic matter. So kind of what was previously known prior to new instrumentation was that we thought chemical complexity kind of led to a recalcitrance or uneasily degradable organic matter. And we thought this chemical complexity would lead to recalcitrant and just microbial access was limited. What we've kind of learned with new advancement in technologies is that there really are no specific plant compounds that are selectively preserved. So we've even been finding over the recent decade is that some of the oldest organic matter in carbon was what we previously thought was labile or easily degradable organic matter. So that kind of made us start re-questioning what is soil organic matter, what leads to it being held in the soil for a long period of time. So part of the question is then, how does some soil organic matter and carbon persist for centuries? So this figure on the right is from one of the seminal papers that kind of started transforming soil organic matter theory. It's Schmidt et al. From 2011. It's published in Nature and is open access. But we learned that chemical and physical protection mechanisms restrict microbial decomposition of organic matter. So if we kind of look on the side on the right, this B section, we can look at these 3, they have it as 3 or even a 4th sector of how carbon can be preserved. So I list in this first one is organo-minerals associations, or essentially organic matter is being absorbed. So this middle one it's being absorbed by either iron oxides or different types of minerals within the soil matrix. And essentially the bonds that are created with the organic matter kind of shield it from either enzymatic attack or microbial attack. Another one is number 5 here, physical disconnection. So these physical barriers can essentially prevent microbial degradation, whether it is because the carbon is in a nanopore that the microbe can't even get into the pore. It could also, if it's in such a small pore, it can create anaerobic conditions, which then limits the decomposer's abilities to essentially only anaerobic bacteria or could work in that type of condition. So there's different ways that we can get physical disconnection and also just really just location wise. There's not necessarily a microbe right next to the small piece of soil organic matter. And when I'm talking about small, I'm talking about very small, like smaller than your width of your hair. So it's not like we're looking at chunks of soil organic matter. We're looking at really the pore scale level. And then another one is number 7 is the freezing and thawing, but that's kind of more of a climate condition. So really, instead of thinking of it as chemical recalcitrance of plant litter, which was what really the historical view and on the left side here was, we've kind of shifted to physiochemical protection is kind of the term that we use. So also we want to think of pools and fluxes. So most models, well, first I'll state that soil organic matter is in a constant flux. It's always either being degraded, it's always being preserved, it might be being formed by decaying microbial matter. But really the existing models approximate soil carbon as discrete carbon pools, that it has distinct chemical, physical, and functional properties. So a lot of it still uses the old historical view of some, whether maybe it's lignin, for example, that was traditionally thought of, it can last in the soil for a really long time, whereas labile plant detritus could be easily degradable. And what we've kind of gone with is in a more, this is a paper from 2020, is a probabilistic representation of organic matter interactions within the soil environment, also known as the PROMIS model. This is still being kind of pushed forward, but this is being led by what I would say is some of the front researchers on soil organic carbon. And this model has 3 core observations. The first is that 2 identical organic molecules, if it enters the soil, it can have dramatically different residence times in the soil. So just because it's made of the same material doesn't mean that it's going to have the same fate once it enters into the soil. And we can't predict the precise fate of any individual carbon molecule within a given time frame, but as the model is formulated is that we can put a probability that certain classes of chemical compounds will encounter specific fates over a given time period. And the last core observation is that although the turnover of the bulk soil organic carbon is sensitive to the ecosystem scale properties such as climate or the soil texture, the influence is really indirect. And as I kind of mentioned in the previous slide, was that this is happening at the pore scale level. So really, we got to think about what's happening. Is it in the area of a microbe that it could degrade it? Is it not? What type of plant material or microbial material is being in the system? And essentially what they're doing is assigning probabilities to each of these situations. And this is from the same paper that I mentioned. It's from Waring et al. It's also an open access from 2020. But essentially, what we see on the left side is a river system. And that's how they are trying to convey the message, is that really they want to de-emphasize the soil pools of whether it is a long-term pool, a short-term pool, and really just make it into one soil continuum model. So up at A is where the carbon is entering the flow from multiple streams. So we have in the white dots is woody debris, the yellow dots is the leaf litter, and the black dots on the right is like root exudates. D is essentially the atmospheric CO2, so when it gets respired and used up. So essentially when we have these different compounds coming into the system, it can have different accelerations. So we can see when it comes to C, it's essentially a fast track to the CO2 pool. Whereas in these little eddies, part C here, we can see that some of them, they don't even go into the atmosphere. Some of these other points, they get stuck and locked in what I would refer to almost as like a nanopore. So they're not even going to be interacted with within the system. But one thing that we need to remind ourselves is that when we do something different to the soil, whether if we till it, whether if some dramatic land change happens, maybe there's a huge rainstorm and it caused some soil erosion, all these things will alter this meandering stream of carbon, and it can essentially increase the access to microbes, or it can decrease. It depends really with individual molecules and its location to decomposers. And I just wanted to have this slide here so that people can look at what I feel is some of the most important papers right now, changing our view on soil organic matter. I think part of the reason why I started with this talk was last year in Quanta magazine, Popkin wrote a public paper for really how soil organic matter is changing. I know some people have read this. If you haven't, it's a really good introduction of soil organic matter and kind of where we're at. But if you want more academic papers, really this list here is an excellent starting point. Soil organic matter you could talk about for an entire semester. So please look at this if you want, and if you have any questions, let me know. But I'm going to quickly transition to one of the topics that we talked about is biosolids processing methods and its effects on greenhouse gas emissions. So in my PhD, I did some work where I was wondering, well, I think biosolids is a bit of a unique organic matter source in that it has more metals than, say, manure or plant litter, some yard debris. It's a different type of mixture because we put it through pipes in our sewer systems, and then also at the wastewater facility, some use iron or aluminum salts to help bind up the phosphorus. So I was kind of thinking, well, maybe this iron, which is part of the absorption that I talked about earlier, could possibly increase persistence of the organic matter when it's applied to soil. But I also wanted to know essentially what would happen in an extreme event, such as flooding, which creates an anaerobic environment if it persists long enough. So I kind of wanted to see, because iron is an element that fluctuates in redox potential. So essentially when it encounters in an anaerobic environment, so no oxygen, it changes its chemistry, and that could potentially lead to the release of organic matter, I hypothesized. So quickly looking at the experimental setup, the biosolids, I had biosolids that did receive iron salt addition at the wastewater facility, and it was about 9%, maybe even a little bit more on a dry weight basis. And a biosolids, both of them anaerobically digested, and the other one was less than 1% on a dry weight basis. We applied on a nitrogen basis at an agronomic rate, and then at a very high reclamation rate, which is typical for biosolids use sometimes. And then we did this on a sandy loam and a clay soil. And a sandy loam soil has less, it's a little bit more inert, I would say, than a clay soil, just because of a clay has many different minerals that organic matter can interact with, as well as smaller pore spaces. A quick look at the soil types. The sandy loam and the clay soil both had very low carbon concentrations to start with, and I didn't alter the pHs, so the pHs were slightly acidic. Looking at my little jars that I had set up, I had made hundreds of these. On the left is the sandy loam soil, and then on the right is the clay soil. But really, I just wanted you to be able to see kind of what we're working with. So this is a small incubation study. It's not field scale. And the first phase that I tested was gas sampling for 3 weeks at 60% water holding capacity. So there would still be some oxygen in the soil. And then I fully inundated the soil with water for 2 weeks. So I made sure that it was completely saturated during that 2-week period. And then I allowed both soils to dry down, and they differed in length because the clay was able to hold on to the water much longer than the sandy loam. And if we look at essentially after the 2 weeks, we can see the 2 weeks of wetting. You can see that on the right, on this top left image, on this right jar, you can see this black material, and you can kind of see it in all the right jars. And these are at the biosolids applied at the reclamation rate. And then in the top right, you can even see kind of, it looks like a gray area versus the brown surrounding area. And that's showing essentially that the iron was reduced. This is known as a depletion in the soil. And then I want to quickly just show you quick results. Really, the main gist of it is that for carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, the biosolids without iron applied at the reclamation rate, this red line, it completely dominated the statistics in that it was producing much more greenhouse gases than, so the blue line, for example, is the biosolids applied at a reclamation rate with the iron. And we can see that it's actually similar to the, especially in the clay soil on the right, we can see that it's fairly similar to applying the biosolids without iron at the agronomic rate. So despite applying 5 times the rate, we saw similar emissions to the biosolids without iron at a 1 times rate. And this is with methane. Really, the only signal that we saw was from the biosolids without iron. And this was the same with the nitrous oxide. I don't present this because I'm just trying to show you kind of the work that I was working on, and that the initial hypothesis is correct that iron does seem to be, at least for a very short period of time, which is only 60 days, increase the persistence of soil carbon. And then the other one was that we can see, if we go back a slide, essentially after the 3 weeks of at 60% water holding capacity, it was starting to taper out the greenhouse gas emissions. And then after the 2 weeks, which is indicated by these 2 vertical lines, after the 2 weeks of water inundation in all jars, essentially, including the control, which had no amendment, in the urea, so just a nitrogen fertilizer, everything kind of increased greenhouse gas emissions. And what that's kind of showing is that these severe events can create pulses of greenhouse gas emissions among all soils, including probably some of the native soil carbon that was in the soil. And now I'm going to quickly transition to my last topic, which is the systematic review that I am leading, Greg Evangelos and Walter Lee Daniels are helping me, as well as many team members across the country, on trying to review all the literature in the biosolids soil carbon realm. So what's the problem? The problem is that we don't have a peer-reviewed quantitative synthesis of carbon stock changes after biosolids land application. And many of maybe you or wastewater facilities and biosolids users, we need a quantitative synthesis to understand what these stock changes may be in order to access carbon credit markets. And I put this slide here because I want to introduce really the systematic review topic. Many of you probably have read traditional reviews, is what I would call them. Most likely you haven't really come across a true systematic review, as there's really limited amount in the environmental field so far. It's very typical in medical science, but in environmental literature, it's lagging behind. But this person tweeted that the systematic review part of a meta-analysis, which is a meta-analysis is the statistical portion of a review, is the more important part. So a meta-analysis without a systematic review is garbage, and a systematic review without a meta-analysis is good. And I'll get into the reasoning of what a systematic review is, but essentially, without doing a review systematically and accounting for all the biases, the meta-analysis, it's going to give you a number, but at the same time, it's not going to tell you the whole story. Whereas at least if you do the systematic review part, it'll tell a lot of the story, and eventually someone will probably go back and run the statistics on that data. So a systematic review has a well-defined specific research question. And I say it's often PICO-based, which is it has a defined population, it has a defined intervention, comparator, and outcome. It has to have a peer-reviewed protocol. So most of the reviews I'm sure that you've read have not had this. What I'm kind of going over right now is we did have a peer-reviewed protocol back last year, and it definitely improved our review. The study search, we're attempting to find all published and non-published literature on this topic. It's really important because a lot of time, especially in sciences, unfortunately, journals would like to publish positive results versus we didn't see any difference. So sometimes if we didn't see any difference, they don't get that data doesn't get published, but at the same time, that is a result that we need to find because it does influence the statistics. The study selection, you have to explicitly state what you're going to include and what you're going to exclude in the protocol. This is important so you don't have biasness of scientific creep where you're kind of changing what your review is going to be. You need to assess all of the included studies quality. This is, I think, the most important part of the review. And a lot of times, most literature reviews don't include this in environmental science, is that just because you have all of these different studies that are included, it doesn't mean they're of the same quality. You really need to assess each study and for its own individual biasness and quality of evidence. And then once you've done all of this and you hopefully have enough similar data, you can do what's called a meta-analysis. And the meta-analysis is the combining of the different studies, qualitative and quantitative data. And this is what helps provide a clarity with studies that may have conflicting results. So maybe if one had a positive result and one had a negative result, it helps clarify it some. The collaboration for environmental evidence and ROSE's protocol. This is a group based out of England that is working towards really, it's an environmental based evidence syntheses group that focuses on systematic reviews, and really they want to make sure that environmental reviews are held to higher standards so that the reviews that are published and used for policy and practice are of the highest quality. And the ROSES protocol stands for Reporting Standards for Systematic Evidence Syntheses. So this table on the right, where it talks about all the methods and the searches that you're going to do, how you're going to screen articles and appraise them, and then how you're going to extract and synthesize the data. You have to, in your protocol, include all of these details. So our specific review question was, how does land-applied biosolids affect long-term carbon sequestration rates? And our population was looking at the soil carbon stock from pretty much anywhere in the world, but restricting the greenhouse and field. We're really just looking for field data, not lab and greenhouse. The intervention was the application of biosolids, but we're restricting it to, it has to be at least a 2-year study. And the biosolids, if it's mixed with other types of composts, it has to be at least 50% on 50% of the mix. The comparator, really we're just looking for a control, whether it was a fertilizer or a non-amended site. The outcome is we're looking for soil organic carbon or soil organic matter values, and it has to have either, it has to be expressed on a stock basis, or it has to have bulk density so that we can calculate the stock. And the study design, we're looking for ideally before and after control impact. So they would have measurements before the study was established and after. But most studies are, they don't have, say, for example, the bulk density at the beginning of the trial, but they have it at the end, and those would be called control impact studies. We used 5 databases. You can see them on the right at the symbols. And then we also used the first 1,000 results from both Google Scholar and Microsoft Academic. And then we also looked at 10 different organizational websites based on the USDA, US EPA, and kind of the counterparts around the world. PRISMA, also known as Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. This is an evidence-based reporting style of essentially you break down where studies are. So we found over 23,000 records across the databases. And then after the duplicates were removed, so essentially we found 16,600 plus unique records related to our topic. And after screening them at the abstract level, we figured that there was 1,189 full text articles possibly meeting our review standards. And after single review, part of a systematic review is everything needs to be double reviewed, and right now we're at about 60% double reviewed. So I've kind of used my analysis of the papers as a proxy of what I believe is going to be included, and we have about 125 unique records that could be included into our meta-analysis. And I've already kind of gone over this, so I'm going to move forward a little bit, but the study validity assessment, we're just breaking down essentially all the different types that might affect the biasness of an individual study. Moving forward a little bit, because I know I'm on time, I'm going to get to the results that we have so far. And essentially what this is showing is a response ratio. So anything above a 0 is a positive increase in soil organic stock. And pretty much all of the studies so far does indicate it. But as you can see in both of these figures, which the bottom is the control with no amendment and the top is a fertilizer. One, there's a greater response compared to no amendment, which is expected because we would have more plant matter from a fertilizer. But we're also missing some data long-term that hopefully we can fill in over time. So essentially what we're looking at is that we have so far limited data, but I've gone through about 40% of the studies. There is still a positive response after a significant amount of time. Biosolids has a better response compared to a control with no amendment versus a fertilizer control. Takeaway points from my whole slide is really that soil organic matter theory is still evolving. There are no specific compounds resistant to microbial degradation, despite what people may tell you. Carbon is preserved through these physiochemical processes, and we should think of carbon as flows rather than discrete pools. I found in my research that iron can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and hopefully in the next few months, you'll hear about the rest of this systematic review that's hopefully almost done. And with that, I know I have a few questions.
Great. Hey, Mike, just to thank you very much, just to keep things rolling. If you could, if anyone has questions for Mike, can you just post them in the Q&A? And Mike, if you could just answer those directly, that'd be great. And we'll keep rolling and go from there.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you very much, Mike. And we're gonna move on to our next, there's Bill right there, front and center. Bill Brower. So our second presentation is gonna be focused on Biosolids emissions assessment models, the BEAM 2.0 update from Bill Brower at Brown and Caldwell. Quick update on Bill for those of you who don't know him. Bill's a licensed PE in several states and licensed wastewater operator, specializing in the management of biosolids and other organic residuals. He is a senior biosolids engineer at Brown and Caldwell, and previously he managed the biosolids program at Blue Plains and DC Water. During his tenure at DC Water, Bill led a team and developed a suite of biosolids products that was heavily involved in the marketing, permitting, and public outreach in the support of biosolids sales and land applications. Bill also spent time at Denali Water Solutions as he developed a greenhouse gas inventory tool for Denali operations, assisted with operational troubleshooting at compost facilities, and was the technical lead on developing transfer station at New York City dedicated to depackaging source separated organic wastes. He's the inaugural chair of the Northeast Biosolids and Residuals Committee on Carbon Trading, and the past chair on the WEF Greenhouse Subcommittee as a former board member of the Mid-Atlantic Biosolids Association. Bill has a BS in chemical engineer from the University of Wisconsin and a master's in sustainable development from the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Bill. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Nick. I just want to make sure you guys are seeing the right screen. Are you seeing presenter view or you're seeing full screen?
No, it looks good to me. I think you're okay.
Okay. All right, great. So yeah, thanks for that. And thanks, Mike. That's really great work. And I look forward to hearing more of your results. I've been tracking that for a while, and thanks for that last presentation. So today, yeah, I think a lot of people have heard about BEAM, possibly have used it, and just want to give an update on behalf of NEBRA for where the current update stands. So I would talk a little bit about the history of BEAM, where it came from, what updates have been going in this most recent revision of BEAM, give some examples of how people have used it, talk a little bit about the review process that's going to be put in going forward so that we can keep BEAM updated as new developments come in, talk a little bit about next steps for BEAM. So for those that aren't aware, the biosolids emissions assessment model essentially is an Excel spreadsheet, but it is kind of the Excel spreadsheet for greenhouse gas emissions, specifically for biosolids, for wastewater solids, treatment, and management. So it allows you to calculate both the emissions and the sinks, so carbon sequestration, like we heard about from Mike, or avoided inorganic fertilizer, something, so emissions and sinks for different biosolids management and treatment options. So this isn't something for your entire wastewater treatment facility or your utility-wide, your vehicle emissions, everything like that. It's really focused on being just around biosolids. And there are detailed emissions factors. If you use some other tools that are out there, biosolids will either assume to be all the same, like there's one generic emissions factor for all biosolids, or you'll have things, like in the WARM model, they use food waste or something to approximate biosolids, or it's as close as you can get, or manure will be used. And so BEAM really focuses on getting the emissions factors that are specific for biosolids. So the original beam purpose, and we'll talk a little bit about how it got started in a second, but the way it's kind of envisioned that it's used, and that's still true with this update, is you can kind of get an estimate of what you can do your greenhouse gas inventory. You can get an estimate of how much your biosolids program, what your emissions are, and you can establish a baseline. You can also use it to determine different scenarios. So if you're doing a biosolids planning exercise, you want to know, okay, if we go with digestion or if we go with pyrolysis or whatever the case may be, how's that going to impact our greenhouse gas emissions? You can use it for that. Or, you've got your baseline, you want to say, all right, if we went to not just, 5 different scenarios, but just if we made this change, we started composting instead of, doing land ap, what would the impact of that be? And then you can also get you get nice graphs that come out of it, so you can see where your greatest impacts are, and that can really focus where you spend your time. I know for me, whenever I've done a greenhouse gas inventory, either at BC Water, at Denali, or ones I see now at Brown and Caldwell, I'm always surprised by how little hauling accounts. I would think, all those, it's kind of the visible impact that you see, all these trucks going in and out of the plant every day. And it just seems like a lot of diesel being burned. And but when you do a full inventory for a facility or just your biosolids program, it actually tends to be significant, but not as big as some of the other factors. So if you get these graphs, you can kind of see where you can focus your energies. So BEAM was originally created in our contract by the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, by Silvis, with help from Sally Brown, Andrew Carpenter, and Ned Beecher. And BEAM is, pretty much their baby. Sally Brown, Andrew Carpenter, Ned Beecher. And it was originally published in 2009. There was an update in 2010, 2011. And then in 2021, there was interest around getting BEAM updated again. CCME saw the value in having the product, but didn't want kind of their name associated with it necessarily anymore. So they allowed BEAM to be updated, but they don't have a formal relationship with the effort anymore. There was also a movement, if folks are aware, Northwest Biosolids at that point under Miley was looking to create an online greenhouse gas calculator for biosolids management. And that effort kind of got merged with the update of BEAM. And there were, last year, there were some, or the last couple of years, there were some significant updates to BEAM funded by New York City Department of Environmental Protection, Bioforce and San Francisco PUC, where they were kind of, for their own purposes, wanted an update of BEAM, and they kind of paid for that and then donated that work of updating it to the general effort. So very appreciative of the efforts that those folks made. So in the new BEAM model, what's kind of referred to as BEAM 2.0, and now this new kind of nomenclature that's being used is BEAM with a little asterisk and then the year, because the idea is from now on that we'll talk more about this, but that BEAM will be updated annually rather than taking a decade off in between updates. We'll try and keep it updated yearly. So for the most recent incarnation of BEAM, which will hopefully come out next month, one of the main added benefits is that there will be up to 10 scenarios. So a lot of times folks want to look at kind of the world of possibilities when you're doing biosolids planning. What everything from sticking with what you're doing all the way to embryonic technologies or something, or maybe at least less established technologies. And you want to see what the greenhouse gas impact might be alongside maybe some economic planning that you're doing. There's more options for unit processes. So things are kind of added in either by the team when they do updates, or as I mentioned before, Bioforce Tech kind of paid to have the pyrolysis module made for BEAM. A lot of the key factors, the most important factors, have been reviewed, calculations reviewed, as errors came up, things like that were updated over time. There's going to be a user guide that's in the process of being updated. And something that is looking to be included in this update is when you're doing these calculations, there's kind of a default value. So you can always change BEAM. It's a open Excel file, so you could change it as much as you want, but there are recommended default values. So if you have anaerobically digested biosolids and you want to know what your methane emissions are from storage or something, there's kind of a default value for that. You can always change that. But in addition, a suggestion was recently made that ranges could be included. So if people did want to tweak it or see, kind of worst case scenario or something, there would be suggested ranges as well. And then for anybody that's used it in the past, wants to see what changes have been made, there's a list of those will be available online. So a few examples of how people use Beam. So you can think how you might want to use it in the future. Here's one from Chicago. So they were comparing their different management options. Folks are aware, Chicago's does Class B land app, and they also have a Class A program. And they wanted to compare the greenhouse gas emissions for those two processes. And I think when they were starting out, they were probably thinking that the reduced hauling, you taking their biosolids, dozens of miles each way to Class B land application sites, would have a big impact, and that was shown to be true. But there's reduced benefits from land applying the Class A material. I think this is largely due to just lower application rates for when you're using it in kind of more urban settings versus rural settings. So you get some results that may not always be obvious just from thinking about the systems that you're talking about. And then you've got concrete numbers that you can point to. This Beam seems to be kind of the international standard. There's a lot of greenhouse gas inventorying and things going on these days, and we're all kind of figuring out how to do these things. But when you get down to the really granular level, something as specific as biosolids management, there aren't always, it's not like IPCC is publishing, emissions factors that are comprehensive for the stuff that we all do. So Beam is really proven to be like kind of the the gold standard for greenhouse gas emissions associated with biosolids treatment and management, including this was in Australia they referenced the Beam, and I think a lot of folks will use it. It's almost Beam is almost one of the values I've seen most out of it is that it's basically like a great literature review, and there has been formally published kind of literature reviews that based off the Beam work, but whatever's in Beam has been really rigorously looked at and assessed. So it's just a great source of emissions factors. So I think a lot of people will go into Beam and pull out the emissions factors that they find most appealing, because it's kind of the best source for those. And then technology specific. So this again is Bioforce Tech. There wasn't a pyrolysis or a bio drying units in Beam, and I think Bioforce Tech, for their own purposes, wanted to be able to say what the greenhouse gas impact of going to a biochar product would be. So that's they paid to have this model or module within Beam added. I think this is maybe Quebec. This example from Quebec is maybe the kind of the full use of Beam. So developing a baseline and looking at all the different direct and indirect process emissions, and then being able to compare your baseline and your current scenario with some different alternatives that they were considering over time. And another way that I feel like a lot of people have used Beam, a lot of, like when I was at DC Water, we had a greenhouse gas inventory that was for the whole utility. So a lot of the biosolid specific emissions factors in our greenhouse gas inventory were based off of Beam, and that was part of a wider inventory looking at process emissions and vehicle emissions, and things like that for the utility. So here's an example from Oregon where they were they used Beam for the biosolids portion of their greenhouse gas inventory. And in the future, I think, again, for kind of as Mike was talking about, there's potential for carbon sequestration from biosolids land application, and I think in the future we'll be able to point to Mike's work, and we could also point to BEAM for some of the other emissions factors. I think there's a lot of interest in folks, including in our NEBRA carbon trading committee. If anybody's interested, please sign up. We're just kind of getting started, but there's a lot of interest in getting carbon offsets for kind of the climate impact of all the good biosolids work that we're all doing. And some of but it all comes down to a protocol. So you have to have, if you're going to have a project that is going to get carbon offsets, it needs to be following some particular protocol. And a lot of those protocols have really general or kind of bad assumptions for what the emissions factors would be associated with biosolids land application. For instance, sometimes they'll assume that the amount of methane that's coming off of biosolids when they're land applied in the field is the same as for cow manure, including for digested biosolids, which is a pretty poor estimate. When we have all those methane emissions coming off, more potent greenhouse gas, it can really it really has a detrimental impact on the overall calculation. So in the future, as folks are looking to try and make carbon offset projects, having BEAM to point to and have something that's a respected resource for the industry and has gone through scientific review and things, to be able to point to that. And because a lot of these protocols will allow you to, if you have a suggestion for an alternate way to calculate something or alternate emission factors, they'll allow you to do that. So BEAM, along with Mike's work, will be able to provide more background for people to be able to approach these protocols and ask for a different approach to doing the calculations. Another plug for the NEBRA Carbon Trading Committee, we've kind of set as a goal to have a project kind of in the works and in maybe not quite receiving carbon offsets yet, but in the train for getting them within about 1.5 years or 2 years time. And that's kind of our goal as a regional organization of trying to get projects that are actually going to be getting carbon offsets. We've been talking about this for a long time, and we want to actually get some projects that are starting to get in, proving out all the issues that are certain to rear their heads as we get going on it. So here's what BEAM, the updated BEAM looks like. So it's a big Excel file, lots of sheets for different unit processes and different graphs and things. But ultimately, what you're getting out is you're getting your emissions. In this case, for different scenarios, they're showing up to 10 scenarios. This is for just kind of a generic plant in the Northeast. And you're getting your emissions and sinks by type of gas, including biogenic CO2. Again, I didn't mention, but that usually won't count against you, but it is good to track that. And so you can start to see where your biggest impacts are coming from different scenarios, and be able to look at, compare the different scenarios and see where you might be having a net benefit or many, or maybe a not so good impact. And BEAM will generate different graphs. So here's another one, just an example of the kind of CO2 equivalents that you could be seeing from different different options for biosolids management. So again, we looked at that kind of informal reactive process for updating BEAM over the past, since it's over its 12 years or so of being around. And now there's a movement towards wanting to keep BEAM up to date every year. So as NEBRA has taken this over, they've implemented a science review team, SRT. So for you biosolids nerds, it's a good chuckle. But so the idea is to have annual updates, annual reviews by this science review team. It's 5 PhDs from academia and from the private world that are reviewing a lot of the most important factors, emissions factors with BEAM, with the most important calculations, and just seeing if there's any new, doing basic literature reviews, see if there's new research that has come out, doing different uncertainty analyses and sensitivity analyses to see kind of how beam's holding up, and trying different test cases and getting feedback from users and seeing what updates need to be happening, how people are using it and making it more user-friendly. So under the current, the SRT is actually meeting, I think right now, and their priority topics before the beam is rolled out, hopefully next month, is these topics that we've seen, including carbon sequestration of land-applied biosolids. So Mike's work is, be a critical factor for this, and some of these other ones that these are not every factor is giving a real in-depth look, because some of them are kind of minor, but these are the ones that the SRT is looking at are ones that have a real big impact on the final calculations for a lot of these alternatives. There's going to be a new website, so it'll be Biosolids Greenhouse Gases, GHGs.org. It's not live yet, but it will be. Here's kind of a screenshot of how Ned is mocking it up at the moment. And I think a nice part about this is that you'll be able to go there and download Beam and get the user guide and things like that. But there's also going to be space for sharing results and tips and how people have used the data. And I think that's going to be a cool thing. We can all come there and kind of share best practices, or say, hey, I made this graph and you can plug it in this way, or I've used the tool in a totally different way that people haven't thought of yet. So I think that's going to be a nice interactive part of the new website. And the idea is that in order to have this, to keep Beam updated and to keep it as valuable tool as possible, does take some funding. So there's going to be a suggested donation on a sliding scale, depending on the size of the utility, or if you're in academia or consulting or whatever. So a recommended donation to try and keep Beam updated. So the idea is, the people that are using it and downloading it are the folks that are most invested in keeping it up to date. So there's going to be, a suggested donation level for keeping Beam up to date. And with that, I don't know if we're back on track for questions, or we can hold them till the end.
Yeah, Bill, I only saw one that has come in so far, and someone was asking just exactly how we access Beam. I do think you kind of just answered that with the greenhouse GHG question, but if you can cover that again and tell us when it's going to be fully available, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think you can still get the original one off, if you search for Beam off the CCME. You have to do a search. I don't think it's like available on their website. If you want to get kind of the old version, they don't link to it. But if you do a Google search, it's still like hosted, so you can still find it. And the new version, will be hopefully next month. It'll be available for download off that Biosolids GHGs.org.
And is this something you have to pay for when you download it, or is it a free tool?
So it's going to be likely a suggested donation. So in the past, it was freely available, but I think there is value in having it updated every year. So I think a suggested donation for those that are going to be heavy users and using it a lot, and have the wherewithal to help fund it. It's not going to be a huge amount, but it'll be manageable costs, and it's just a suggested donation.
All right, fantastic. Any other questions for Bill? I guess I think everyone's on mute, but if you want to type anything into the box, we'll go ahead and answer it. But if not, thank you, Bill, very much. And we're going to switch over to another Bill that most of you probably know quite well, Bill Toffey. So yeah, thanks, Bill Brower. I appreciate it. All right, Mr. Toffey. So hello. Bill is going to enlighten us about a survey of nature-based carbon actions in the MABA region. Little background on Bill Toffey here for those of you who don't know him. Bill has over 40 years experience in the municipal wastewater, environmental, and energy management business. He is the principal of Effluential Synergies, LLC, a sustainable residuals consultancy, and until the beginning of 2022, served as our executive director at MABA. And just to keep things moving here. For the 20 years prior to his MABA experience, Bill managed the biosolids operations for the Philadelphia Water Department. During his career, he authored over 75 papers and presentations to a range of local, national, international, and international technical audiences, which include operator training manuals and programs. Over the past 7 years, Bill has authored over 120 monthly biosolids reports to MABA members that I'm assuming most of you have received. Bill graduated from the College of Agricultural Life Sciences at Cornell and has a master's of regional planning from University of Pennsylvania. He is active in national and international professional organizations. And that was a very short overview of Bill's prestigious career. So Bill, take it away, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Am I coming in? Is my screen showing?
We can see you and we can see your presentation.
Okay, great. So probably you all could be forgiven if you didn't pay huge attention to the COP26 conference that was underway last summer. I mean, with coronavirus out there and with PFAS diverting our attention. But COP26 was a big deal. There was 197 countries represented, 40,000 delegates. Now, at the end of the day, a lot of disappointment around not even being able to agree that coal should be abandoned as a fuel source. But nevertheless, going into COP26 in Glasgow was an enormous amount of science around the predictions of how climate was going to change. A lot of global NGOs had put out papers and positions on projects that they were intending to commit to. And among all the things that they could agree to was that the way we treat our land and our ecosystems has a direct bearing on climate, and climate in turn has an effect on our land. So you had the World Wildlife Federation talking about the climate crisis, you had the Nature Conservancy talking about renewable fuels, and we had the United Nations committing to a decade of ecosystem restoration. One of my heroes in the climate field is Paul Hawkins, who made his fortune selling garden supplies online. And Paul is also an author and a visionary in the sustainability field. And he developed something called Project Drawdown, where his concept was that you could identify hundreds and hundreds of individual projects that, if taken all together, if we all could work on them in our own little area of expertise, we would have a measurable benefit in drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere. And these are just a few of the projects on the website called Project Drawdown that I think would be familiar to us in biosolids, whether it's biomass production or regenerative agriculture or biochar or fertilizing forests. Project Drawdown reminds us that each of us can take our own professional interests, our own personal interests, and cast that interest in terms of how is it benefiting the climate and helping us to meet a global urgent need to draw down our emissions. So we have to ask ourselves in the biosolids field, how can we as a community of practice respond to the challenges of COP26? Getting into the literature on COP26, there's a lot of acronyms, many of which I had to look up repeatedly, like the natural climate solutions and the nature-based solutions, talk about land, opportunities to use the land as a sink for carbon. Then there's OFULU, I don't know how you say it, but it's the agriculture, forestry, and other land use-based carbon projects that join in with the other categories of activities that are looking at mitigating carbon emissions. And over the last couple decades, these have been classified into such broad groups as afforestation and reforestation, or AR is often the term used, and also soil carbon enhancement. Now, afforestation is different from reforestation in that afforestation is where landscape has been so altered that there is no legitimate expectation that a forest would regenerate on that land. And reforestation is where you have removed the forest and it needs some kickstart to help regenerate the forest ecosystem. I see afforestation as the opportunities that the disturbed minelands on bituminous and anthracite coal regions in this mid-Atlantic region have when you see the degraded landscapes lying idle, and an opportunity for restoring forests. So let us, as a community of practice, look at what are the ways in which biosolids can be a tool that local communities can decarbonize in response to COP26 by improving degraded and marginal lands, by enhancing soil carbon, by replacing fossil fuel sources of nutrients, and using regenerative nutrients in the biosolids. Now, COP26 was a very elaborate process. Each one of the 190 plus countries came with a document which was a nationally determined contribution. NDC, these looked at the sectors like electricity generation, transportation, buildings, and agricultural land use was one of those. And all of the plans for the United States were built on state initiatives. And each state over the last couple of years published a state climate action plan. I wasn't aware of this until I started looking at this. In 2021, most of the states in the Mid-Atlantic region issued state climate action plans. And each one had a component that dealt with nature-based solutions. And each one of those nature-based solutions was largely expected to be implemented through a carbon offset approach. Carbon offsets is a way of trading those companies that have excessive emissions that they want to reduce with those activities that are able to absorb some of that carbon in a trade. And there's also a trade of money, which is the key thing, an economic incentive to take an emission that is undesirable for one entity and put it in have an activity that can absorb carbon, get the benefit. There are two types, a regulated carbon market and a voluntary carbon market. I had become introduced to the regulated carbon market probably 20 years or so ago, back in a presentation made to the wastewater industry by Scott Subler, who at that time was with the Chicago Carbon Exchange. And a few years later, I heard about RGGI, which is in our region in New England and Mid-Atlantic, the principal organization that is looking to set up a carbon offset market, largely on allowances that the power generating companies need to offer to activities that can have a benefit in reducing carbon emissions. And so there's RGGI and a regulated market, and then there's the voluntary carbon market. So I started off looking at the RGGI program. And over the course of the last couple of months, RGGI has had its own, has sparked its own controversies. But in this region, it is largely the New England states as well as New Jersey, Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, and maybe Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is halfway in because the governor says, yes, we're in, and the legislature says no. And Virginia is in, except the new governor says, no, we're not in. And New Jersey rejoined. So there's a lot of controversy here, but still the basic concept was that the power generating companies would need to supply some funds to help offset carbon through programs that would be set up to provide renewable fuels, provide energy efficiencies, but also activities that treat the landscape. And for several years, RGGI developed some amazing programs for offsets that involved treating the land. And one such one was a draft model program that each of the states, because these are state-based programs, each of the states would implement. One, for example, on afforestation. Again, the reestablishment of forests on lands that have been degraded. And as you can see on the clips I've taken from their website, it's a very elaborate program that was set up to do afforestation and to seek offsets from the power companies. There was so having looked at that, I could find that there was virtually no results from that enormous effort to come up with programs that the states would adopt for obtaining offsets from the power companies that would pay for projects that would result in afforestation of lands. But New York State had the most amazingly developed RGGI program. And one in particular I thought was interesting was avoided methane emissions. I could see us in the biosolids side possibly looking at the benefits of taking in some money from the power companies to upgrade our methane conversion to power. But you'll see on the left side of the slide here, you could click through a lot of different protocols and procedures and standards. And I think most of you who have worked with farmers would say to yourself, I don't know a farmer who would want to go through that level of scrutiny and that level of auditing. So I called up Kathleen O'Connor, who I know from NYSERDA, who has been involved in some of our programs for biogas utilization. And I asked her whether or not RGGI has been active in the area of offsets, regulated carbon markets. She said, no, they're not active at all. She says, in fact, I'm not even doing energy anymore. I'm doing cannabis. Get that. So, but nevertheless, she says, you need to look at the climate action plans because that shows you where government wants to make a difference in climate. So I took a look at New York State's climate plan. You see, it was just released in October. And you'd see there was an enormous number of goals and projects being recommended and policies that we would be very happy to see implemented. There was one on organic waste reduction, another one on resource recovery at wastewater plants, another one on soil health. So I looked at some of the other states. New Jersey has a very fine program, the 80/50 report released last year. It too looked at opportunities for carbon sequestration on both terrestrial and what they call blue carbon, which is along the coastal wetlands. Pennsylvania, even though it's not in RGGI, it too has its climate action plan, and it looked at carbon sequestration and improved green space is in cities. Maryland, looking at soil health, looking at improved forest management. So by this time, I'm thinking to myself, all right, every state is committed to carbon sequestration. Every state is looking at improving degraded landscapes. I wonder how many of these the folks who are writing these climate action plans have actually managed residuals, managed reclamation work, managed the reforestation of properties. And I realize that we are still in a place where we as professionals in biosolids need to find the folks in the climate side who we can develop alliances with, because these climate plans don't have much hope of being implemented unless we help in that process. So I called up Scott Subler and I said, I've looked through the regulated carbon offset program and I don't see much happening. Is that true? Or did I miss something? He said, you're absolutely right. He says, however, the voluntary carbon market is going crazy. He says, my little company, I was down to 11 people. I now have 50 professionals and we are working nationwide. We have more companies with more money out there looking for projects where they can invest in carbon offsets, particularly around afforestation, around restoring degraded landscapes as forests, but also improving the soil carbon levels in farmland applications. He says, we just don't have the projects. And I said, wow, that is a great story for the biosolids field because we have the kind of products that can help rebuild those soils. And it's true, in the last couple months, the agricultural industry has burgeoned forth with stories about how carbon markets are changing the agricultural industry and how hundreds of millions of dollars are promised to be flowing to farmers as a result of projects that would build soil carbon. The Soil Health Institute had an amazing presentation last month called The Components of Soil Carbon Accounting. And they have a variety of presentations you can buy to listen to and get credit for if you are in the Soil Science Society that deal with how you go about participating in the voluntary carbon market. And they went through some of the big picture concepts of how the voluntary carbon market works. The first thing to know, it's not going to be easy. There's a lot of the protocols are deep and they're extensive, primarily because you're trading money for something that's probably as elusive as cryptocurrency in my book, carbon stores in soil. And a lot of people are involved. They're the owners of the land, the developers, the folks who are third-party validators, the folks that are actually handling the money and trading the money, and those who are monitoring the program over time. There's concern about whether or not carbon land treatments result in a permanent carbon store, or whether it's ephemeral. There's concern about leakage. Leakage is a concept that, so you have promised to engage in conservation tillage in this location, but does that mean that you are doing all-out tillage on adjoining properties? They don't want to be stealing carbon from one source in order to put it to the project that is being funded. So there's also the whole area of verifying the performance of projects that are implemented and how you go about measuring and reporting the success or not of the projects involving land treatment. But that's all been sort of formalized by protocols. And you heard a little bit about that from Bill. Protocols that protect both the project developer as well as the purchaser of offsets. There are three major organizations that work in this area of voluntary carbon markets. And one is the Climate Action Reserve, which you may be familiar with if you do work in California, the American Carbon Registry, and Verra. You'll see that they have things in common. What they have in common is that they classify projects according to the same groups that we heard about in COP26, afforestation and reforestation of degraded lands. They're concerned about agricultural land management, how to build up the soil so that it has a permanently improved reservoir of soil carbon. And if you're in California, they're looking at some of the special projects that Californians seem to be interested in, such as biochar and organic waste diversion to digesters. There's also a category called REDD, R-E-D-D, which refers to projects that involve the harvesting of wood for furniture and construction, and how those operations can be managed to minimize carbon loss during the forest operation. This is an example of the Climate Action Reserve's Soil Enrichment Protocol. I bring this up in particular because a couple of years back, the draft of the Soil Enrichment Protocol was not clear whether or not it would permit the use of biosolids as a soil amendment. The protocols that are developed by CAR and Verra and the ACR all start with consultants with great credentials coming up with the protocol, an advisory board of folks who critique and advise them on the nature of the protocols, and then a public airing of the protocols that involves stakeholder engagement. And during the stakeholder engagement for this soil enrichment protocol, the biosolids practitioners in the Northwest and in California stepped up and made comments that were later incorporated. And the soil enrichment protocol from CAR does in fact accommodate biosolids. But it's notable that to date, no biosolids project has been included in any of the soil enrichment projects that have been engaged in by CAR. The American Carbon Registry, I think, is an important one for us in this region because its protocol for afforestation and reforestation is one that has plausibly a value to us here in this region for its ability to provide voluntary carbon offset credits for projects that involve the repair of degraded coal mine lands. And it has a methodology that you can download off the internet, which has extensive number of equations, because a part of it is in establishing a baseline biomass that's on a particular piece of a project site, and then projecting out in time how the biomass will change through the afforestation methods that are being deployed. And here's Vera's soil carbon quantification methodology, which in light of Mike's presentation earlier, I really wonder is probably going to throw a lot of questions into whether the methodology that is already out there is going to be adequate to do the carbon offsets. But the principle is still excellent. The principle is that we need a national approach that, that regularizes the way we're going to be measuring our soil carbon and quantifying the changes that our programs manage. Now, I think what we need to know in biosolids is that there's a huge superstructure of organizations that are forming around this opportunity that the voluntary carbon market presents. Climeco is the company that Scott Subler, who I've mentioned a couple of times, is the CEO of. And you can see that in the context of an environmental, social, and governance advisory team, they are putting together panelists of expertise to help match property owners with companies with an interest in buying carbon offsets. One of the big projects that you can find on the internet is one that's attached to Climeco. They're working with a group called Restore the Earth Foundation, which is also Pennsylvania-based. And here is a website which I thought was completely enrolling, in which they are branding their project down in Mississippi as North America's Amazon, which connotes that we are going to be restoring the forest functionality, the ecosystem services of the Delta area of Mississippi. And it's a project that they claim is going to be worth $12 billion in economic value. It's going to plant 100 million trees on 1 million acres. And that's Restore the Earth Foundation here in Pennsylvania. Do we have any sites in Pennsylvania where we could use 1 million trees, or we could restore 1 million acres, where we could benefit from $10 billion worth of economic activity? I think we have our work cut out for us because we have not sought that kind of project. There's also consultants in the area of financing and in the area of measurement, evaluation, verification. So for those of us who are soil nerds or interested in soil improvement, soil enrichment, those of us who are managing flows of carbon, this is a business opportunity. Already we have companies such as Living Carbon, Terra Carbon, Native Ag involved in this area. So we have the challenge ahead is that we are living in a structure which is not responsive to the challenges that the voluntary carbon market puts in front of us. We've seen the RGGI program largely fall by the wayside, at least its offsets that involve land. Just this past week, the new governor in Virginia has chosen to cancel the state's participation in RGGI. The procedures that have been built into the protocols are not easy ones. There's a learning curve ahead of us. We're not only talking about biosolids as a source of organic amendment when we look at the opportunities to restore degraded landscapes, and we do not have a deep network involved in digestate manures and paper mill sludges. And right now, we're still suffering from the fact that on the RGGI market, a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is only worth about $2.50. The program that Restore the Earth Foundation is working on is estimating about $20 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. We are in a system of each state has its own regulatory stovepipes, and as do we. And we have to ask ourselves whether or not the kind of projects we engage in biosolids are really at a scale that meets the urgency of the climate challenge. But I think it also challenges us to rethink how we do our business in biosolids recycling. Could it be that our new clients ought to instead be those who are consulting with corporate sustainability officers, those companies that are putting together the projects that are seeking. We have a great resource here. We have about 1 million dry tons of biosolids, or more than 1 million tons of biosolids in this in the region. If we use 50 dry tons per acre, we could have as much as 24,000 acres of land available or able to be reclaimed each year. At $20 a ton, that's over $18 million flowing from corporate sustainability offices into our recycling programs. Now, this may only be 5 or 10% of the total cost of doing the program, but nevertheless, it's better than zero. I did learn of a project that's out in Southwest Pennsylvania. It's called BECCS. It uses a offset terminology called BECCS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And they use that concept of taking the CO2 emissions from from electricity generation and burying it in the ground. But it does also rely on taking biomass as one of the sources of fuel. What if biosolids were being used to grow the biomass? That's a part of that equation. I think that would be a winner also. And as you see down below, the opportunity for ash and biochar coming off of the thermal process is one of the options they're looking at. What if we were to employ a project such as that in the region? So I thought, how about we set up a new organization? You have MABA, great organization, love it. But how about we set up a Mid-Atlantic collaboration for carbon recovery options, macro? Suppose we take on building the kind of relationships with other sources of residuals, collect the organic matter and nutrients from the 60 million people in our Mid-Atlantic region, and harness the 1 million acres of degraded coal mine lands that are available in Virginia and West Virginia, and that have gone unreclaimed. Suppose we develop programs similar to the one that the ACR standard for the AFALU with bioenergy component in the voluntary carbon market. Suppose we took on actually building liaisons with the energy and water utilities, the mining companies, the universities, the political leaders, the regulators, and the environmental activists that are out there concerned about the lack of progress in responding to the urgency of climate change. So we are environmental stewards. We represent a class of professionals who are committed every day to wise use of resources and to the care of the land. So let us all take on a project that will be at the scale and with the kind of intentionality that matches the urgency of the challenges we face with climate change, with the ecosystem crises, and find a way to enter our material into a different kind of program, and one that will help solve the problems that the generations ahead of us will be facing. That's my pitch to you. Nick, I'm sure there's no questions because this is like old stuff, right?
No, Bill, thank you. We only have one question right now in the chat.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, it says, Bill, more of a theoretical question here, but I see that carbon offsets do not really address carbon caps. What are your thoughts on this?
Carbon what?
It just says caps, carbon caps.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't at all. You're right. It's purely to meet the intentions of the corporations that want to demonstrate that they've reduced their greenhouse gas footprint, that they are willing to invest money to buy offsets from landowners who are undertaking carbon storage, and it's outside the immediate regulated carbon cap program. But they would all like to be able to show that they are reducing their carbon footprint.
Yeah, agreed. All right, another couple more questions just came in. One from Drew Whitlock. Drew says, what if wastewater produced biosolids were mandated to be reused and regulated similar to wastewater effluent? 100% of biosolids reuse with an NPDES-like permit for each facility. Biosolids would be viewed on the same scale as water.
Sign me
that
up.
Would make you very happy.
make me happy.
Culmination of a career.
Let's do it. I mean, Bill, Bill Brower. I mean, the whole intentionality of the program up in NEBRA is to create that kind of connections that would allow us to start to involve in carbon trading. So we got something going here, Bill.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are interested in doing it, and yeah, like you say, these protocols are very intricate, and just starting to do a project, we're gonna or a handful of projects, we're gonna learn a ton, and we want to do a voluntary one and a regulated one. And is Mike still on?
No, he had to leave.
Mike was not. No,
Mike had to leave. Okay.
Today's his first day with the Oregon Department
That's a
of
pretty
Agriculture.
good excuse. All right.
So he took his first hour of work off to be with us. How about that?
And another question just came in is, I think we actually just covered it a little bit, but we were talking about, Bill, one of your last comments is what do you mean by voluntary markets? I think, as we strive towards a mandatory rule, I think that's kind of going to, if you want to elaborate on voluntary at this point as to who's contributing, that would help.
Yeah, I think the agricultural one is sort of an example. A project developer was able to cause a number of property owners to agree to adopt a set of new agricultural practices that would be demonstrated to improve soil carbon stocks. And as a result of that collaboration with the property owners, they were able to verify that they had a certain amount of tons of carbon capture to offer private companies. And then they sell to the highest bidder. Those companies are looking to buy the carbon offsets as a way to achieve their corporate goals for reducing their greenhouse gas footprint. So it's outside of RGGI. It's outside of a formal. It's more like cryptocurrency in my mind. It's, people bid the price that they think that they want to pay for the carbon, the tons of carbon. Now the carbon registries, they play the banker in the middle. They're the ones that define what your carbon tons are in the offset. They're the ones that hold the value of that carbon, in a register, so that it will have value going forward. It's not an ephemeral thing. It's a document. This property generated so many carbon credits, tons of carbon offsets, and that is sold and can be resold in the marketplace. So it's an internally regulated market. It's voluntary, but it's only voluntary in that it's outside of government regulation.
Great. All right. It looks like we have time for one more question here. And I guess both the bills, this might pertain to you both, but are there any technology gaps that you guys see holding back the carbon offset market, or do you perceive this as a lack of investment?
Well, I personally think it's just so new to us. We don't have the connections. Nobody has heard from us in the voluntary carbon market area, and so we have to make ourselves known. And I think there is some legitimate issues that Mike raises about whether or not biosolids carbon is actually, able to be traded, because it may not be resilient enough. It may go into the soil and disappear because it's fueling the microbes.
Yeah, I don't think there's a technology gap. I think all the pieces are there. There's a market, there's protocols, there's buyers, there's the biosolids. It's just, they all come down to what are the assumptions that are made of how much carbon is being sequestered or how much organic fertilizer production is being. So it all comes down to these emissions factors that are in BEAM and other things. And so there's that gap that we need to fill in by just doing it and engaging in this market, like Bill says.
Great. Thank you guys for that answer. We did have one more question come in. We're just about at time right now. So I'm just going to read it off real quick and we'll see if we can answer it and then wrap it up for today. Those that replace digestion, such as chemical treatment with lime or chlorine dioxide, or those that can reduce the elimination with digestion, drying, and or pyrolysis. You know what this looks like more. Oh, I'm sorry. This was a comment to your question earlier, Bill. I was reading this as we were doing it live. So I'll tell you what, we are going to Bill Brower. If you want to take a look at that question, I think we could provide some more feedback to that offline. It is now 1:30, so I apologize. I thought that was a question, but so we're going to wrap it up for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you to our presenters who are still on, Bill and Bill, and all of you that attended from around the country and around the world, wherever you are. I'd like to let you know that we did record this today, so we will be sending out the recording and copies of the presentations to everyone who attended. And also our next webinar in the series will be on March 15th. And the title for that one, we will be focusing on the science of biosolids PFAS. So please look out for emails and other information about the next one. And we thank you all for coming today. We hope to see you in the next one, and have a great day and a great week. And thank you again. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.